The next time your city goes dark online, it might not matter. Not because you found a better VPN, not because your government fixed the cables, but because a private company put a second internet in the sky, and it doesn't need your country's permission to reach you. If your phone can talk to space, who controls your signal? Who decides when that signal becomes a weapon or a lifeline? And why are governments real? Governments quietly rewriting their military plans around a network whose kill switch sits inside a corporate policy document? By the end of this story, you'll understand how Starlink is changing global power, why it's making states behave like customers, and why the most decisive battles over your future connection aren't happening on Earth at all. Picture a war room at 2 a.m. A screen shows a map, not of troops or tanks, of coverage. Little green zones where data still flows. Little gray zones where it doesn't. In the gray zones, drones lose their eyes. Units lose their voice. Civilians lose the ability to prove what's happening to them. And then a single variable changes the sky. A terminal the size of a pizza box locks onto a satellite, moving faster than a rifle bullet, and suddenly the gray zone turns green. A video call goes through. A drone receives coordinates. A journalist uploads what the local authorities beg them not to upload. That one connection looks like a gadget. At scale, it's a new kind of power. Because in the old world, the internet belonged to geography. Wires under streets, towers on hills, cables under oceans. Governments could regulate it, tax it, cut it, or quietly slow it down until the truth became buffering. Starlink's punchline is brutal. It moves your dependency from geography to an operator. And that operator isn't a country. Starlink is not the first satellite internet service, but it is the first one that behaves like a global utility with its own launch program, its own hardware supply chain, and a constellation so huge, it's changing what space infrastructure even means. By early 2026, Space Reporting described Starlink as having well over 9,000 active satellites. Scale matters because it's what makes the service resilient. You can't take out the tower if the tower is the sky itself, but the scale also creates a new asymmetry. The faster the constellation grows, the harder it becomes for any government, especially smaller, poorer ones, to negotiate from a position of strength. In telecom, timing is power. Move fast enough, and policy has to chase you. Now, here's the part. Most people miss Starlink isn't just internet from space. It's a private network that can route around national chokepoints. And that ability turns into geopolitical leverage in ways we're only beginning to understand. Before we get there, you need a clean mental model for how Starlink works, because the mechanism is the motive. Imagine the internet as a city of roads. For most of your life, you've been driving on the same 2 or 3 highways your local telecom company, their fiber backbone, and the undersea cables they rent or own. Even if those highways are privately operated, they sit on public land. Governments can put toll booths on them. Governments can close them. Starlink builds a new highway system that floats. Thousands of low Earth orbit satellites move in coordinated shells above the planet, close enough that the signal feels like broadband, not like shouting at the moon and waiting for an echo. Your Starlink dish, which is really a flat, phased array antenna, electronically steers its beam and tracks fast-moving satellites overhead, handing your connection off from one to the next like a relay race. Then comes the part that makes regulators nervous, the lasers. Starlink says each satellite carries optical intersatellite, linked space lasers capable of operating at up to 200 Gbps, turning the constellation into a global internet mesh in space. In practical terms, your data doesn't always have to touch your country's ground infrastructure until Starlink chooses where to drop it. So the question isn't merely, can I get online? The question becomes, where does my traffic go? And under whose rules, before it reaches the rest of the internet? This is where the story shifts from technology to power. Because power loves invisibility. And network routing is invisible to almost everyone. Now, if Starlink stopped here, if it remained a dish you buy for rural internet, it would still matter. Faster internet changes jobs, education, migration. But Starlink is becoming something much bigger. First, it has expanded to more and more countries at speed, which makes its footprint political whether it wants to be or not. Second, it is pushing beyond dishes into phones. In its 2025 progress materials, Starlink said it completed deployment of a first-generation direct-to-cell constellation, with more than 650 satellites launched in about 18 months. Not a dish, a phone. Once your normal phone can reach space, the balance of power shifts in ways you can feel in your own pocket. So let's look at how this plays out. The first major shift is that Starlink turns connectivity into a bypass. For decades, authoritarian governments relied on a simple truth: you can't organize, report, or coordinate if you can't connect. When protests flared, the internet kill switch wasn't a metaphor. It was a tool, sometimes blunt, sometimes surgical throttle. Social networks, block messaging apps, shut down mobile data, target a city, target a neighborhood. Starlink attacks that tool at its root because it's physically outside the state's cable and tower infrastructure. That forces regimes to hunt for the units themselves. It turns information control into a game of contraband. And contraband changes behavior. It creates black markets, informant networks, and new risks for ordinary people, whose crime is simply owning a box that looks like home internet equipment. In early 2026, Euronews looked at how Starlink can help reconnect societies after shutdowns and asked a question that should land like a punch if satellite connectivity becomes common. Can a regime still turn off the internet in the way it used to? Maybe not. But there's a catch, and the catch flips the story from liberation to leverage. Because if the internet bypass is privately owned, then the bypass itself can become a control point. This leads to another dangerous consequence. Starlink forces governments to negotiate for oversight, often under pressure. Traditional telecom licensing is national. Governments decide who gets spectrum, where towers can be built, what data must be retained, what surveillance interfaces must exist. A telecom company negotiates from a position of dependence. It needs local permits, local fiber, local sites. Starlink's dependence is different. It needs market access, yes, but it can often provide service at the edges of legality through roaming plans, gray market terminals, or cross-border usage until regulators clamp down. That doesn't mean it's unstoppable. It means it has leverage. It's enough leverage to change the tone of negotiation. The conversation becomes, how do we legalize what's already happening? Sri Lanka became a case study of what that negotiation looks like. When a government says, not so fast, analysts described how Sri Lankan officials raised concerns about lawful interception and national oversight. In other words, if a Starlink terminal can route traffic through space, how does the state enforce its legal access requirements? The debate wasn't about whether the internet should exist. It was about who gets to see it. These are ugly questions because the two answers are both dark. If governments get robust interception access, the technology becomes another surveillance layer. If governments don't, the technology becomes another sovereignty challenge. Either way, the decision is no longer fully in the hands of citizens. It's negotiated between a corporation and a state. Here's another shift: Starlink sells resilience as a subscription, and resilience becomes dependence. Resilience used to be something built by states, or at least by national champions. Redundant fiber routes, hardened switching centers, emergency broadcast systems, all of it tied to territory. Starlink offers a resilience plan you can ship in a box. When a hurricane takes down towers, a wildfire eats power lines, or a submarine cable failure isolates a region, Starlink can be deployed faster than rebuilding terrestrial infrastructure. Space coverage becomes a substitute for repair. Le Monde noted that moments of crisis have spurred demand for Starlink's reliable service in places where terrestrial networks fail. And when that happens, the emotional memory sticks. Hospitals remember the day Starlink worked. Emergency responders remember the day it worked. Businesses remember the day it kept transactions alive. That's how dependency is born, not through marketing, but through trauma. And dependency is a political resource. Because once a country's critical services quietly incorporate Starlink as Plan B, A regulator who wants to ban it is no longer arguing with a company, they're arguing with their own voters. But the story isn't just about disasters. In war, resilience is the difference between coordination and chaos. Picture this: a Ukrainian artillery unit moves through a muddy field near the front lines. Their officer carries a device the size of a pizza box, the Starlink terminal. Every few hours, they reposition. Every few hours, they set it up again, angling the flat face toward the sky, waiting for that green light to connect. Through that connection, they receive coordinates for Russian positions. They upload drone footage. They call for medical evacuation when shells land too close. That terminal isn't just internet. It's their eyes, their voice, their lifeline. Ukraine became Starlink's most dramatic proof of concept. The symbolism was intense to many observers. A privately owned constellation helped a sovereign state keep its communications online against a larger invader. But then came the moment that should have ended the fairy tale. Public reporting described a request connected to operations near Crimea, and Musk's refusal to enable Starlink there. A PBS analysis emphasized that Musk was not under a military contract at that time, and later noted that the U.S. military funded and contracted support, with key details undisclosed for operational security. One way or another, the takeaway was unmistakable. A private individual and a private company had meaningful influence over a battlefield communications layer. That's not just a controversy. It's a new category of power: corporate veto. This means Starlink privatizes strategic communications, then sells them back to the state. After the early ad hoc period, the U.S. government moved toward contracting for Starlink services for Ukraine, rather than relying on personal goodwill. Spacex and other outlets reported. The Pentagon confirmed it was buying Starlink satellite services for Ukraine, while withholding many details for security reasons. That move sounds like accountability, and in some ways it is. But it also rewires the global norm. It makes military-grade connectivity something you can buy, like cloud storage, war as a service. Once that norm exists, it spreads. Because every military planner is haunted by a simple question: what happens if the fiber is cut? If your answer is, we have satellite backup, then you need satellites. And if Starlink is the only system that already exists, at a global, high-capacity, low-latency scale, then it becomes the default even for governments that resent it. That's how infrastructure becomes inevitable. Perhaps the most invisible but critical effect. Starlink blurs civilian and military infrastructure until the line is almost unusable. SpaceX has been explicit that it's building Starshield, a line aimed at government and defense needs, using a proliferated low Earth orbit architecture, designed for resiliency and constant connectivity. SpaceX has also won a contract with the U.S. Space Force related to Starshield. So now, in the same orbital neighborhood, you have broadband satellites serving farmers, truckers, kids doing homework, and architectures designed for defense and intelligence customers. This is where geopolitics becomes uncomfortable. Because if a constellation supports military operations, adversaries will treat it as strategic infrastructure. But if that constellation is also providing civilian communications across dozens of countries, targeting it risks massive civilian spillover. In other words, the same network can be both shield and hostage. This ambiguity is already showing up in diplomatic language. In February 2026, Bloomberg reported, Iranian and Russian diplomats criticized Starlink at a UN scientific meeting, describing it as violating sovereignty and blurring the line between commercial and military technologies. You don't have to agree with their framing to understand the implications. A private internet service is now being argued about, like a strategic weapons platform. Now we come to the dark heart of this story, the moment that changes everything. In early 2026, something unprecedented happened. The Russian military had been using Starlink terminals in occupied Ukrainian territories, not authorized, not purchased through official channels, gray market, smuggled, hidden among regular equipment. For a few days, maybe weeks, they had the same advantage Ukrainian forces had: satellite connectivity that bypassed everything. And then, suddenly silence. SpaceX identified the unauthorized terminals, cross-referenced their signals, traced their usage patterns, and flipped a switch. The Russian soldiers in their trenches, waiting for coordinates, waiting for orders, waiting for anything, they went dark. One moment they were connected to the world's most advanced satellite network. The next, they were staring at blank screens, suddenly, as blind as if they'd never had the technology at all. Think about what this means. For the first time in history, a private company reached into an active war zone and disabled the communications of a major state military power. Not a cyber attack, not an act of war by another nation. A corporate decision, a policy enforcement, terms of service violation. A single company had the technical capacity and exercised it to sever a nation's military communications on a battlefield. The kill switch isn't a dramatic red button in some villain's lair. It's priority rules. It's geofencing policies. It's the ability to say, this territory is unauthorized, or this feature is restricted, or this use case violates policy. And if this can be done to Russia today, what guarantee is there that it won't be done to someone else tomorrow? Perhaps your country. Perhaps when you need it most. This brings us to another tool of power. Starlink turns connectivity into a tool of sanctions and counter-sanctions. We're used to sanctions being about bank transfers, oil, and microchips. Starlink makes a new kind of sanction imaginable: signal access. When a government sanctions a country, it usually targets companies and individuals, but information flows are typically restricted indirectly through payment bans, hardware bans, or control of domestic infrastructure. Starlink adds another lever: deny service. Restrict, geofencing, or limit certain uses, and even when Starlink doesn't act, the mere fact that it can act becomes geopolitical pressure. It forces every government to ask a question that feels like science fiction, but is quickly becoming policy. Can a foreign company provide a nationwide communications layer inside my borders without my consent? If you answer yes, you accept a new kind of external influence. If you answer no, you may push your citizens toward illegal usage, black markets, and sharper repression. Either way, the state's old tools look less reliable. Now, at this point, you might think, okay, that's geopolitics. That's other countries. This doesn't touch me. It does, because Starlink is dragging satellite connectivity into the phone in your hand. In July 2025, T-Mobile announced its Starlink-powered T-satellite service was live in the United States. It started with messaging and location sharing in dead zones, and it included text to 911. Ars Technica noted the service initially supports texting and is expected to evolve toward voice and data. Later, T-Mobile expanded emergency satellite texting access for non-T-Mobile customers. That sounds like a product update, but it's actually a power shift: emergency communications. Moving on to a privately owned space layer. Emergency layers are political. They're regulated. They're funded. They're expected to work when everything else fails. When a service becomes tied to emergency response, it becomes harder to challenge. It moves from nice to have to we can't risk losing it. And once that happens, a private operator gets something no normal telecom can buy: emotional legitimacy. Here's a scenario you should sit with. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's plausible. A hiker gets lost. The phone has no bars. They text 911 by satellite. They're rescued. Now imagine a regulator later tries to restrict the satellite service due to surveillance concerns, or licensing disputes, or political tensions. How do you argue against the system that saved a life? That's not marketing. That's governance by gratitude. But what about when this technology becomes the network? In 2025, the Associated Press reported SpaceX agreed to acquire wireless spectrum licenses from EchoStar in a deal valued around $17 billion aimed at boosting Starlink's capabilities, including satellite-to-cell connectivity, with a commercial agreement involving Boost Mobile access to direct-to-cell. Spectrum licenses. That's not a side hustle. That's the DNA of a telecom empire. In the old order, mobile networks were among the most regulated, politically sensitive infrastructures on Earth. They're tied to emergency services, They're tied to surveillance laws. They're tied to national security. They're tied to who gets to own the airwaves. If SpaceX is buying spectrum at that scale, it's not merely filling dead zones. It's building the capacity to compete with carriers first in rural areas, then wherever physics and regulation allow. The Washington Post described this as SpaceX making a major move into the mobile network industry, stirring concerns among traditional telecom giants. Starlink isn't only building an alternative internet, it is positioning itself to become the network. And once Starlink becomes a mobile layer, it becomes harder for states to treat it as foreign internet that can be fenced at the border. It becomes part of everyday life. That's when power shifts from optional to structural. And this is where the dark side stops being theoretical and starts being balance sheets. Because infrastructure isn't just power in a patriotic sense. It's power in the boring, terrifying way money becomes gravity. Most governments can pressure a telecom company because the telecom company has assets inside the country. Offices, towers, employees, bank accounts, licenses. If the company misbehaves, the state can fine it, raid it, revoke it, nationalize it, at least in theory. Starlink's most valuable assets don't sit on your soil. They move over your head at 27,000 kilometers per hour. That changes enforcement. But the real protection isn't speed, it's cash flow. SpaceX does not publish full public financials the way a normal public telecom would, and that alone is revealing. Yet analysts have been blunt about the direction. Starlink has become the main revenue engine for SpaceX, the part that can generate recurring subscription income rather than one-off launch contracts. When a company controls a subscription that millions of people and institutions depend on, it gains a lobbying position that looks less like a firm and more like a utility. And the subscription model has another trick. It makes influence renewable. A pipeline is a single project. A railway is a single route. Undersea cables are huge but slow to build. Starlink is different the moment you stop paying. You drift out of the network. Connectivity becomes a monthly decision, and monthly decisions are private. They don't require parliamentary votes. They don't require public debate. They're made by consumers, businesses, and agencies, one invoice at a time. That's how a geopolitical shift sneaks into normal life. In October 2025, SpaceX hit the milestone of launching its 10,000th Starlink satellite. Only a portion of launched satellites are operational at any moment. But the headline itself tells you what Starlink really is: not a product, but a manufacturing system, a factory whose output is orbital infrastructure. And here's the detail that makes the factory terrifyingly self-sustaining. Those satellites don't last forever. Estimates describe an operational lifespan on the order of a few years. That means Starlink isn't building a one-time constellation. It is committing to perpetual replacement, perpetual launches, perpetual expansion, because if replacement stops, the network decays. The service, and collapsing the service would collapse the revenue. The incentive is obvious: keep launching, keep selling, keep expanding into new markets, keep finding new categories of customers, which is exactly why Starlink keeps widening its mission. Rural broadband, then maritime, then airlines, then government, then war zones, then direct to cell, then spectrum. Notice the pattern? Every expansion is a new form of dependency, and every dependency is a new form of leverage. A government that is hostile to Starlink still has to consider the cost of blocking it. Angry rural voters, angry businesses, angry emergency services, a visible gap with neighboring countries, and a narrative that the government is holding back progress. A government that is friendly to Starlink has to consider a different cost: dependency on an external operator for critical communications, and a slow erosion of its ability to enforce rules on data, privacy, and security. Either way, the state is negotiating with gravity. That's why the EchoStar Spectrum deal mattered so much. It wasn't just a business headline. It was a statement: Starlink wants the right to operate not only above telecoms, but beside them, inside the same regulatory bloodstream. And the moment Starlink is in that bloodstream, The fight stops being satellite internet versus fiber. It becomes a fight over who gets to be the default network when everything else fails, and who gets to charge rent for that status. Now, if this were only a U.S. story, it would still matter. But Starlink's influence is global. Precisely because telecom markets everywhere tend to share a dark feature concentration. Most countries don't have truly competitive telecom landscapes. They have a few dominant operators, and those operators often have close relationships with the state. Sometimes they're partially state-owned. Sometimes they're controlled by politically connected families. Sometimes they simply hold so much infrastructure that any government has to treat them like critical utilities. Which brings us to another shift Starlink destabilizes domestic telecom monopolies and the political deals attached to them. Le Monde reported that in Africa, Starlink's rapid expansion pushed traditional operators to respond by cutting prices, increasing speeds, and pursuing satellite partnerships, while governments worried about licensing, sovereignty, and the economic impact on national telecoms. This is where the dark side of capitalism shows up, because Starlink can do something that sounds like market competition, but behaves like strategic pressure. It can skim the highest value customers. Think like a telecom executive for a minute. Your company built towers. You paid for fiber. You paid taxes. You negotiated rights of way. You built service obligations into your licenses coverage requirements that force you to serve rural areas where you don't make money. Now a new player enters that doesn't need your towers and doesn't share your obligations. It doesn't have to serve every village. It can target businesses first, government agencies, wealthy households, and then expand. That is classic cream skimming. It shifts profits away from incumbents, while leaving incumbents with the least profitable obligations. If enough high-margin customers leave, the incumbents raise prices on everyone else or cut investment. Either way, the social contract around telecom gets stressed. And once telecom becomes stressed, politics follows. This is why governments that would normally protect their national operators face a dilemma. Protect incumbents and look anti-progress, or allow Starlink and risk hollowing out a strategic domestic industry. In South Africa, this tension turned into policy theater. Starlink struggled under local empowerment requirements, and regulators treated its service as unauthorized, even as people used roaming and gray market setups. Then, in December 2025, the Associated Press reported South Africa revised its rules, so foreign-owned satellite operators could meet empowerment requirements through equity-equivalent programs, rather than mandatory local equity sales. That is not a company adapting to a nation. That is a nation adapting to an infrastructure trend. Now we move from politics on Earth to politics in orbit. Because Starlink also turns orbit and spectrum into first-mover real estate. Orbit sounds infinite until you look closer. In the shells Starlink uses, there are only so many safe, useful pathways. There are only so many frequencies that can be reused without interference. Those resources are coordinated internationally, often through processes involving the International Telecommunication Union. And the ITU's own materials emphasize how messy global constellations are from a licensing perspective. National licensing differs, and a truly global constellation can involve more than 200 separate licenses around the world. Here's the part that feels like a conspiracy until you read it in plain legal language. The ITU process has a first-come flavor. File early, coordinate early, and you can secure priority rights. That shape what competitors can do later. In 2019, SpaceX filed plans for tens of thousands, more satellites beyond its initial approvals, sparking commentary that it was flooding the ITU with paperwork. This is how a new kind of landlord is created, not through owning land, but through owning the right to transmit through space. And now every major power has noticed, because they can read a map the same way that War Room can. Europe is building IRIS, explicitly framed by EU institutions as a secure connectivity system, supporting autonomy and digital sovereignty, with governmental and commercial applications. China is pushing megaconstellations like Guowang and Qianfan. Ars Technica reported China's ITU filings outline nearly 13,000 Guowang satellites, and that launches have already begun. And in early 2026, multiple outlets reported China submitted an enormous batch of ITU filings totaling roughly $200,000, satellites a strategic claim on orbital and spectrum resources rather than a near-term build plan. Here's the micro hook hidden in this paperwork. The biggest battle over space internet might be happening in documents you will never read, with consequences you will absolutely feel. Because if one operator secures priority rights in key bands and key orbital shells, competitors become second-class tenants. Their business models change. Their capabilities change. Their prices change. Orbit becomes political economy. And now, the final way Starlink changes power is the one most people ignore until it's too late. It externalizes systemic risk onto the commons. Space is a commons that behaves like a fragile ecosystem. With enough satellites, you don't just occupy. Orbit, you change the probability structure of collisions. In mid-2024, public reporting based on SpaceX filings to the U.S. Federal Communications Commission described Starlink satellites performing nearly 50,000 collision avoidance maneuvers over a 6-month period, averaging about 14 thruster firings per satellite. By early 2026, reporting described even higher maneuver counts during 2025, reflecting how crowded low Earth orbit is becoming, and how much work is required to prevent the first catastrophic collision. SpaceX responded by announcing plans to lower the orbits of about 4,400 satellites, from around 550 km to about 480 km, reducing collision risk and ensuring faster deorbiting for failed satellites. Again, that may be responsible. It's also a reminder that Starlink is so big that its operational choices reshape the space environment for everyone else. And space isn't just a traffic problem. It's a cultural and scientific problem. Astronomers have warned for years that bright, satellite constellations interfere with observations. SpaceX has responded with mitigation efforts and even published brightness mitigation best practices, arguing it is working to reduce visibility. Meanwhile, peer-reviewed work has continued, measuring satellite brightness and comparing it against limits that professional astronomy communities consider acceptable. This is the dark side of megaconstellations. The profits are private, but the collision risk, the astronomy, impacts, and the long-term orbital sustainability costs are shared. The European Space Agency has been blunt about this broader debris problem. In its annual space environment reporting, ESA describes Earth's orbital environment as finite and warns that even stopping new debris production is not enough. The existing debris population can keep growing through collisions and fragmentation, and active debris removal may be required to avoid runaway scenarios. If you've ever wondered how an internet service becomes a geopolitical problem, this is how it changes the physical meaning of the commons. So, if you zoom out, all these effects are less like separate events and more like one pattern. Starlink is turning connectivity into geostrategy. It turns censorship into a contraband problem. But it also turns the bypass into a private choke point. It forces governments to negotiate oversight and lawful access, often under public pressure and uncertainty. It sells resilience as subscription insurance, and insured societies become dependent societies. It privatizes wartime communications, then normalizes government contracts for strategic connectivity. It blurs civilian and military layers through defense products like Starshield. It introduces signal access as a new tool of sanctions and foreign policy and demonstrates the terrifying reality of corporate kill switches in active war zones. It pushes satellite connectivity into ordinary phones, making the system emotionally and politically untouchable. It destabilizes telecom monopolies and the political deals built on them, especially in developing markets. It turns orbital shells and spectrum filings into first-mover real estate, and it pushes systemic space risk into a shared environment. No single country truly governs. Now comes the part that should make you uncomfortable, because it's where the morality gets messy. Starlink is genuinely useful. In a disaster, it can reconnect hospitals and rescue teams. In remote villages, it can enable education and commerce that were impossible under the old monopoly of geography. For people who have lived with slow, expensive, Unreliable connectivity, Starlink can feel like a miracle. But usefulness is not the same as accountability. The same system that can reconnect a school can also route around a government. The same system that can save lives in a hurricane can also become a strategic asset in a conflict. The same private constellation that makes the internet harder to censor can also make it easier for a handful of corporate actors to dictate terms to countries that have no alternative. That's why the villain of this story can't be one man, even if his personality makes headlines. This isn't just about Elon Musk being unpredictable or charismatic or stubborn. The villain is the economic logic that says whoever controls infrastructure controls the bargaining table. That logic used to apply to railroads, oil pipelines, shipping lanes, and undersea cables. Now it applies to orbital slots and space-based internet. And once an infrastructure becomes default, it becomes invisible. You don't notice the power until it's used against you. Until a regulator demands a backdoor. Until a government demands a shutdown. Until a company quietly changes the terms of service. Until your country realizes too late that the emergency network it relies on is not actually sovereign. So what is the exit door in a world where the internet has a second sky? It doesn't mean you can unplug. It means you pay attention to governance. It means states and alliances invest in alternatives like the EU's IRIS, so no single operator becomes the only option. It means regulators build transparent rules for lawful access and privacy that apply consistently, rather than negotiating in panic after hardware is already inside homes. It means the global community finally treats space traffic management as infrastructure policy, not a polite suggestion. Because right now, Starlink is not merely changing global power dynamics. It is exporting a model infrastructure as a private empire, delivered by subscription, protected by first-mover advantage, backed by military contracts, and powerful enough that governments have to bargain with it like it's a state. And the most unsettling part? Starlink was built to connect the world. But today, the plug for one of the most important power cables on Earth sits in the hands of a single company. And perhaps the real question is this: when did we give them the right to pull it? If you want to understand how invisible power structures are quietly reshaping our world, watch our next investigation. We go deeper into how the infrastructure you depend on every day is becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer hands and what that means for the future of freedom.